Hi, my name is Taylor Smith. I am from Vytautas Magnus University in Coolness, Lithuania. And today I am going to be sharing with you some preliminary research I've been working on regarding community-driven values for Lithuanian and French university students who are currently studying English. So in order to do that today, I'm first going to speak a bit about English in context in each of these regions. Of course, it's important to talk about some of the big questions that was leading this research, and of course the sociolinguistic methodology. I'll then share some of the student responses divided into language motivation and language attitudes. Finally, some preliminary conclusions, next steps that I hope to carry out with this research, and a few references. So naturally, when we talk about English in a more broad context in the university system, we can really see that there is now this idea of linguistic super diversity on campuses. Not only are so many scientific publications and scientific work being done in English, but we can also see that the cultural capital and the cultural influence of English continues to grow. This has led, of course, to many unintended consequences in which English is often pushing out other languages and other cultures, leading to some very complicated situations. But one thing is that's certain is that we are now talking about different types of communicative behavior in language learning, translanguaging, heteroglossia, etc. So we're seeing, again, these shifts in communicational behavior, styles, and especially student motivation. English in Lithuania is quite interesting because we're looking at the post-Soviet context, in which English has increasingly replaced Russian. We see very distinct strands of discourse around the English language, some of which are very positive and open to English in regards to globalization, and other that are, of course, much more negative in terms of English, seeing English as quite a threat to the language. In terms of Lithuanian youth especially, quite extensive research has been done, and there's been really an explosion of the youth culture interacting with English since the 1990s, and the country being able to open its borders once again. Russian has slowly been downgraded from its cultural capital to today having more of a communicative function. And this is especially true in places like Vilnius, the capital, where there is quite a bit of linguistic diversity still today. In France, we can see that on paper, the language policy between the two countries is very similar. Of course, France has its Académie Française governing body that it's going to really try to enforce as much as possible certain standards in the French language. There have been many campaigns to fight the rise of anglicisme in the French language, and some feelings that English has grown culturally too powerful. Guides have been published on how to avoid this kind of English, quote, intrusion. And many corpora seem to demonstrate that these anglicismes are filling really an expressive role, as the French words, of course, exist in tandem. To that, we can also add the idea that many metropolitan francophones still do have a great deal of linguistic insecurity and a lot of fear surrounding their own English language abilities. Despite all this, we can truly say that the French-English bilingualism remains one of the more culturally prestigious forms of bilingualism, despite the linguistic and cultural diversity in France. So that kind of sets in place these different contexts. So I think from here we can ask ourselves, as this linguistic super diversity continues to rise, English really has cemented itself in terms of cultural capital, especially in the Gen Z age group. How does this scenario actually play out for these students, where the discourse can be either very sympathetic towards English or very hostile, and especially with the amount of time and interaction these students have in online communities? What kind of intrinsic and what kind of social values does English hold for these particular groups? In order to learn more, I carried out a series of sociolinguistic interviews with 21 Lithuanian respondents from Vytautas Magnus University and 21 French respondents, students from La Sorbonne Nouvelle. We went together through some demographic information on each student, and then to a more in-depth sociolinguistic discussion, a semi-guided interview about the students' perceptions of their knowledge of English as capital, other general insights that they had about English and their use and interaction with it. And this data was collected between September 2020 and May 2021. The interviews were carried out on Zoom. Most of the students were between 18 and 21 years old, but there were a few kind of non-traditional students that were a little bit older. They had a variety of majors and study subjects between about B1 and C1 level of English. The majority had been studying English since primary or elementary school, as is the case in both of those Lithuanian and French school systems. In terms of the Lithuanian students, Lithuanian was the most common L1, but a few families were also Polish speaking. Their parents typically spoke both Lithuanian and Russian. And in terms of the French students, their L1, or the language that their parents spoke most often at home, included Armenian, Creole, Moroccan Darija, Spanish, and Croatian. So quite a bit of linguistic diversity. I've divided the student responses kind of into two big categories. Why are we here? So why are they learning English? And something I'm going to call the Instagram input, but really more has to do with their expressiveness in English. So why exactly are these groups of students learning English today, and what are their different motivations? So globalization remains one of the most important and most cited, especially in terms of work. It came up quite frequently that this group of students are very worried about their future job prospects, and they feel that English is going to be the key to their future success. What's quite interesting is that students cite not only English-speaking countries, but we see here France, Spain. Another student in the next slide mentions Hong Kong. So there's this idea that if these students want to succeed in the workforce anywhere in the world across global borders, they will need to be able to speak English. And this kind of idea of fear and stress and falling behind is also going to be a major theme. So this particular student was a little bit older, 27 years old. And he mentioned quite frequently that for him, he felt that English and globalization went hand in hand, but that he was also feeling a lot of apprehension, as if he was already falling behind in his particular English level. And this student was Lithuanian, was, let's say, quite successful in English courses and things like that, but still had these deep feelings of apprehension, as English was seen as fundamental for building that work community. Again, even places like Hong Kong were cited as almost in the minds of many students, or in this particular student, as English speaking. And it's not just for work, of course. These students frequently mention the desire to connect with others and create a sense of community abroad, to really connect, to learn about traditions and build very deep bonds, actually. So it wasn't just on a surface level, but they were very, very interested in that communicative aspect of meeting people and being able to travel and have that freedom. This particular student was Lithuanian, but this was very, very frequent on both the French and the Lithuanian side. getting to know cultures. Again, this comes up over and over again. And I think what's also interesting, coming back to that professional aspect of globalization, is that this student cites this, and many others did as well. They are aware of the fact, they have a really developed sense of metalinguistic awareness, that the type of language that they use on a daily basis, that they might have picked up from various aspects of pop culture, is quite different from the professional language skills that they think they need. So that was also associated with deep feelings of insecurity and fear that I'm not going to have the capacity to be a part of this globalization on a professional level. So we see that desire to connect, but also, again, some fear and some hesitancy. Quite a few students made sweeping statements that everyone in the world speaks English, which is quite interesting. When they're pressed about it and given certain locations, they're quite convinced that they could be dropped off anywhere in the world and be able to communicate with a certain level of English. So they remain quite confident about this fact, which is very interesting. So again, the sense of I can go anywhere, I can connect with others through speaking English. But it's not all positive again. Both the French and Lithuanian students mentioned over and over again the sense of feeling left behind, of feeling stressed. We see twice, really stressful, it's really stressful, but I'm willing to overcome that because it's so important for me to communicate with other people. So in a few words, just to summarize this motivation, we see this desire for globalization, for communication with other cultures, but also this fear of being left behind and dealing with this stress that it entails, but really willing to overcome that because of this sense of newness and this sense of discovery. So how they feel about English and about expressing themselves in English is very interesting. And we might also wonder how and why are they integrating English into their daily speech on an everyday basis. So I think the first thing that we can consider is the idea of code switching between either French English and Lithuanian English. And can we actually consider what's happening truly code switching, or are we moving towards some kind of mixed code that is prevalent in youth languages? So here is kind of a small selection, a little word cloud based on frequency of some of the words that students cited most often. And you see we have quite a bit of variety here. Never mind, period, OMG, literally, etc., etc. And so what's interesting is this intersentential code switching where we just have this one word, or is this really being integrated into one mixed youth code? And we'll see later in some of the quotes that when asked why a particular word is used, especially if there is an equivalent, and there always is, most of the time the answer is that it's not as expressive, or it simply has a different feeling. So the concept of emotion and feeling as it's linked to these code switches is, I think, something very interesting and worth seeing a bit further. So the origin of many of these cited terms was, of course, various forms of social media and internet communication. Every single student that I spoke to was a part of some kind of online community. So I'm going to call this Instagram input, but we could replace it with any kind of social media, especially TikTok currently. And what I saw was that this concept of on-trend language is really fundamental for the idea of social media English fluency, because the students are very, very interested in the idea of sharing and producing content. Even those that are that said that they were not publishing so much on their own social media, they were very interested in finding content. And the idea was that the best way to find content that they were interested in was in English. This is a screenshot of a short article, short caption ideas for profile pictures that really illustrates that Instagram, for example, is not just about sharing pictures today, but really kind of microblogging for these students. And I think it's important to not underestimate how important this has become in how they relate to English and expressiveness. So sometimes students were noticing that they had started using a term integrated into their speech, but it seemed almost subconscious to them, and they weren't always even aware that they were doing it or why. So one of the French respondents was discussing the word chill. Now, in her particular case, she had also given this the same form as a French verb, so chiller. So she used it in French, j'allais chiller, but also in English as well. She mentions that for her, it came from TikTok. And so for her, it's really important to be like others, to show that she is cool by association and by using this particular term. And that is another theme that's going to come up again and again. So period was quite popular in this particular moment as it was seen on TikTok. And as an aside, many of this so-called internet slang for these students seems to come from AAVE, and this has been quite researched as well. So I think that really merits further study. So again, we see that they often say that they use it without realizing it, simply by association, because it's cool. They often refer to themselves as their generation, their young generation, and it's not something that they would use with others, with their parents, for example. So there's a lot of metalinguistic awareness here, that it's something coming from social media. It's something cool. By using it, they can show a sense of belonging. And I love this. It's a kind of vibe that my parents wouldn't understand. They really like to use this expression about something being a particular vibe. So creating a certain atmosphere through that. Students, of course, it was very common for them to talk about using certain bad words that they felt had conveyed something stronger in English. And of course, many terms come purely from the apps and technology themselves, like and scroll, for example. Again, much like the example of Chile, scrollname in Lithuanian. So we do see that it's sometimes adapted into the L1 as well. It's also quite interesting to note how many of these students talked about the connection between community, belonging, slang, and expressiveness. So this idea that a particular English accent or American accent is somehow more relaxed, more casual, and more expressive was something that was very common. So again, the sense that it's a bit more extra, I thought that was quite an interesting quote. So that it somehow is more emotional and expressive and allows this particular generation, these students, to be part of a community that has this emotional component that they might not be able to find in their L1. Which is, I think, quite interesting. This concept of coolness and modernity, again, we see this aspect of it being casual, of it being happening, so something in the moment. So they're also aware that a particular slang term might be fleeting, but the expressiveness behind it is going to last and again create that sense of online community. There's also this frequent idea for many of the students that English is somehow easier, whether it was compared to Lithuanian or French. The student also spoke about her Arabic speaking family, which also the concept of, for her, this Moroccan Arabic, which is not real Arabic, which is, from a sociolinguistic aspect, is quite devastating. But to see that there is a hierarchy there of difficulty and expressiveness. And it was very common, especially for the French students, many of whom at home spoke other languages such as this Moroccan Darija, and other Laotian, for example, and many students said that they had difficulty expressing their emotions in that L1 of their family, but in English it felt easier, both in terms of grammar, but also in terms of expressiveness. So an idea that there's a different emotion, that it's somehow better, is also very interesting to have that kind of language hierarchy there. This was one of my favorite excerpts. A student whose family was originally from Mali, and she just loves speaking English and using it at home, even if her family, she said, doesn't understand. She talks about how she enjoys using these small expressions. Instead of saying that she's ready in French, she'll just say shoes in English, like she's putting on her shoes, or that to say je suis épuisée, literally I'm exhausted, I'm very tired in French. She prefers to say I'm exhausted in English, because the French term is just too strong in some way to say that she's épuisée. So on the one hand, it's kind of a barrier to keep certain people out of the communicative experience, but also a means of play and something fun. And this was very, very common among the students as well. And they talk about how it's fun for them to use these kind of expressions, to use it with their friends and not with their teachers or parents, to create that kind of community. They talk about it feeling right, how it just makes sense for them, how their L1, be it French or Lithuanian, is somehow more restricted, and they feel that they have more freedom in English. So that underlying value of openness and freedom is something that came up quite frequently. Again, this concept that English can somehow express more, and also how it is linked to the idea of having more content again. So we might wonder if there's a link between just the sheer amount of English content online that they're interacting with so much, and all of these ideas of expressiveness and openness that seems to be linked to English. So for some preliminary conclusions, I think we can say that with these two groups, English as seen as a mobility tool and a means of increased cultural contact. However, it's very unlikely that these students are going to say that they are passionate about English from a literary perspective, or something of that nature. It really is just a tool, a means to an end, to travel, to have those different professional experiences. It's definitely a part of daily communication, but not at the level that I think many governing linguistic bodies might think. We're talking a few small words, perhaps phrases here and there, but actually many students thought that speaking too much in English in a given conversation was also a sign of being a bit pretentious. So I do not think it's at this extreme level that some might think. It's interesting that their own linguistic backgrounds seem to be of little impact of how much or how little they were using English, interacting with language content, but it was really their age group that seemed to have the biggest effect on forming those kind of communities. Time and time again, English seems to be related to expressiveness, openness, and fun, I think, which is very interesting. I hope to continue this research and especially dig deeper into those multilingual aspects, to look at English as expressive language, perception, and prestige, if I can go even further with these concepts of accent as well, and the so-called internet accent and what that means to them. So I've really enjoyed it so far. I'm looking forward to continuing it. I have just a few selected references. I thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you very much.